Good morning, everyone. I had some technical difficulties this morning. My phone wasn't working, so I just got it hooked up for some strange reason. So if someone could let me know that you can hear me, that would be brilliant. Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for that. Really appreciate it. All right, so this morning we're going to be talking about something that I sadly know a lot about, because respectful workplace is something that I deal with actually quite a bit. I work with it in terms of just teams, understanding what respect means in the context of being more effective. And I also work with respectful workplace, sadly, when things have gone awry, as my mom says, and things have gone off the rails and there's an investigation. So I've sort of seen the full spectrum. I've been involved with internal investigations, I've been external, but I've also done a ton of work, as some of you may know, in employee engagement. So that plays heavily into how we work together, how we respect each other. So today we're going to be talking about some different pieces. We'll see how much we can get through today, and the rest we'll do the next session. I probably have too many slides in here, so I'll have to cull them for the next session. I think the biggest piece really comes down to that I see every day when I work in this space or anything related to this space. People use the term respectful workplace, and I don't know if everyone knows exactly what it means. There's a slight misinterpretation, I think, in terms of the extreme nature it has to be to go to an investigation. And I'm hoping that after this first session, you'll be able to understand what it is and what it isn't, which is the biggest piece in my mind, and really start thinking about what it looks like in your world. Have you seen it? There are very few places that it doesn't show up at all, disrespect. Having said that, it's really an understanding of how you, as an individual, whether you're a leader, whether you're an employee, and as a team member, what your contribution needs to be, okay? And in the next session, I'm also going to talk about the organizational component. So what respectful workplace should look like in organizations. I can absolutely open it for questions as well. I mean, I develop policies in this. So if there's any questions around some of the challenges that you may have, you can send in confidentially in the chat, especially in the next session, or even this session as well. If there's anything specific that you're wondering about that you want me to address, either in this session or the next session. I know it's a very big, with the Me Too movement and all these pieces, there's absolutely a lot of conversation. I've gotten significantly more requests for investigations, which I only do for select clients when I can, because they're very all-consuming. And you could be on a plane tomorrow and you're tied up for a week and a half doing those. So it's something that I see more of, and I'll hopefully give you a few insights as well into what I'm noticing in those investigations as well. So again, not that you want to ever get to the investigation side, but invariably it's going to happen in most organizations at some point, whether you deal with it internally or you have a third-party person coming in to help you out. So in terms of respectful workplace, why do we really care? Like, what really makes a difference in terms of respectful workplace? What does it mean to you? So just send me a note or two in the chat. Tell me what it means to you, why we care. Yeah, it makes a better work environment for everyone. Thanks for that. Productivity, happy people work harder. Oh my gosh, you guys are awesome. That's exactly right. It's one of those things that it significantly impacts what we do. And as much as it's not formally employee engagement, it's not formally productivity, it's not formally all those pieces, it plays into all that. It plays into better teams, it plays into better environment, better culture. There's so many elements. And most organizations are starting to get a handle on it, but sadly we're not getting as far. Ooh, a little feedback there, if everyone can just make sure they're on mute. So what does it mean to be respectful to another person? Let's take the first question there first. So just think about it for a minute. You don't have an answer right away, but what does it mean to be respectful? What are some words, some behaviors that come to mind? Working together, solve problems rather than looking to place blame. Love that, actually. The blame piece is interesting. I'm glad actually that came up because the term blame often will play out in, I often see it in bullying. And we'll talk a little bit about the similarities and differences in the words respectful, harassment, bullying, what they all mean. So the word in terms of how blame gets made, how it's done, or how it's done behind people's back, those things all very much play into what respect could look like. So what does it feel like? I'm sure there's people, not everyone here just finished high school or university or college. So, you know, some of you may have, but most of us probably have a little bit of experience behind us. So we've all worked in environments over the last maybe 5, 10, 15, 20, or even 30 years that have been a little bit disrespectful. What would you notice if it's disrespectful? So blaming would be one that came up there. What else? What else could we notice in a disrespectful workplace? What would it look and feel like? These are great questions, by the way, to ask your teams, right? So really just brainstorm, put them into different groups and say, you know, what does it mean to be respectful to another person? This is interesting, the variations that you'll see, and also disrespectful workplace, what it looks and feels like, and have you ever experienced it in your environment? Badly or inadequate about your work, excellent tension, yes, extreme tension. And sometimes, I will be honest, when I've worked obviously in extremes, you know, very mild all the way up to the extreme investigation where people, you know, up to termination, you know, there's a lot of times where people actually who are under investigation have no idea why. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and it's going to weave into some of the things we've talked about in the past around understanding your impact, right? Really understanding how it affects others. Because that's one of the things I've noticed most is that there's very few, although there have been a few respondents, so other people have complained about, respondents who've actually said, yeah, I definitely went over the line, which actually kudos to them, and they've actually probably saved their jobs sometimes if it was extreme. But otherwise, a lot of people just don't have a clue of why there's tension, and sometimes they don't even know that they're the person creating the tension. So it's disrespectful workplace. Every environment looks different. Every level, the threshold of what respect looks like in a very, for example, in a mining environment where you're off in a camp somewhere versus in a professional law office downtown. You know, again, as much as respect is one thing, it's how it impacts everyone. What does it feel like? Does someone feel put off by something someone said? And it may affect you very differently than it affects me. Okay, so there's a lot of nuance here that we have to start thinking about. So when you actually look at what respect is, to show honor, to value, to be thoughtful about, to have regard for, to hold in esteem, to be considerate of others. Not just ourselves, but yes, ourselves as well. But having said that, to show honor, to value, to be thoughtful about, it takes energy to do that. We have to notice things. We have to look for things. So that's sort of how the definition looks there. One of the biggest things I notice is a lot of people will say, oh, that's the manager should be doing something about that. And that is very true. It is absolutely true. If something, and if you skip right to the bottom, person with authority, it should always be a higher threshold for leaders. Okay, so if you're a leader right now, or you know of a leader, or you're higher up in an organization and you can influence another leader who maybe is putting up with some things with their team, the onus is on them, the responsibility is on them to take it on. That's the employer/manager responsibility. If you're a manager who has it within your team, or you've noticed it and you want to nip it in the bud, and you're not sure how, we'll talk about a few little tips in here, but also, are there other people in the organization that can help? For example, I always say if it's something really awkward, you can have another leader come in if it's helpful to help create a better conversation. If you're giving feedback to an employee that is doing something that they may not even know about. Right? So it's really, really important for them to know that. The person who's actually the source of it, so if you go right to the top there, the source, the person that actually could be doing the offending behavior, that person, all of us could be that person, okay? It literally does not take much if we don't notice an impact we're having on somebody. For example, say Atlantic Canadians. right? Sometimes we're the target of jokes in our smaller towns and everything else. Just as an example, maybe we went off to a large center and we were teased about coming from wherever. That absolutely can resonate as bullying, and it can qualify as bullying or harassment, right? Depending on the context, depending on how it's taken, if you say a joke to somebody or you say something and the person looks a little put off by it, it's our responsibility, again, with the best intentions in the world, to actually say, oh my gosh, did I go over the line there? I'm so sorry, I did not intend that to happen. Or if someone notices and says, oh, Heather, when you said that, I don't think so-and-so took it very well. We have to take responsibility to go and accept responsibility for our own actions. The target themselves. So this is the hardest one. So when I have people call me, or I have some employers that I work with, and on occasion you'll have someone I work with there call me and say, oh, this is happening. I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel comfortable telling the person to stop. Okay. So there is an obligation generally for the person who feels offended to go and say something to the other person. But there are always extenuating circumstances. Maybe that other person is the head of the organization. Maybe the other person is their boss. Not saying they shouldn't go tell them that they felt offended by it or they felt put off by it. When you said the following, it really made me feel uncomfortable. Simple little conversation like that, but it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people to do that. So you really have to take that in stride. There needs to be, as an example, for the person who's feeling offended, lists in your policies. Who can the person talk to? They can speak to their leader, if their leader's the person, or they can speak to another leader in the organization. Maybe they're really comfortable with someone else so say it's, say you're in broking, and all of a sudden you're, oh, well, I'm really close with the claims person. Go talk to anyone. Just talk to someone who has a leadership element that can actually help you work through it, because that's their responsibility as well, right? So who can they talk to? Who can they talk to? What is their responsibility there? And the observer, here's another one. How many times do we just go, oh, that was really uncomfortable. That shouldn't have happened. Oh my gosh, she did it again. I can't believe she did that again. That was just so wrong. We have an obligation as an observer to either bring it up to the source who's doing it, maybe give them a little feedback, because chances are 90% of the time they didn't mean it that way. There's not bad intentions there. We also have an obligation to bring that to someone else as appropriate. So maybe it's on your team and your leader didn't notice, your manager didn't notice. You can say, oh, I think Sally is being really uncomfortable when so-and-so says this. So maybe the next time it happens, or if it happens on a frequent basis, the next time that happens, the manager can take the person who said it aside and say, look, I'm sure, I know you're trying to have fun or whatever, but I think that a couple of people find it a little uncomfortable, or so-and-so finds it uncomfortable, right? And help work them through it. Because it's horrifying. And I've seen people completely horrified. They can't sleep at night because they've been told that they're saying something or doing something inappropriate. It can happen to any of us, absolutely any of us. So I want you to tell me what you think of this one. As a definition, a respectful workplace is one where all employees are treated fairly, difference is acknowledged and valued, communication is open and civil, conflict is addressed early, and there's a culture of empowerment and cooperation. So just read that over for a second. I want you to tell me which of the words, is there anything in there you think is really great, you like, or is there anything there that's a bit challenging? Because I think this is a great definition to think about in terms of, does this show up in your world? So for some of you can just send me a quick note, and just a reminder, go on mute for those that may not be. I can hear a few folks there. Just don't want to get any more feedback. So if you can just let me know what you like that in there. I'll tell you one part I find is my favorite part. Yes, love that. Empowerment. Yes, all employees are treated fairly. The all, emphasis on the all, excellent. It is a good, I really like this one. The open communication, absolutely. And how often does that happen in your world? And those are I really like those as well. And another one I really like here is conflict is addressed early. How often, now conflict, you don't want someone to be on top of everything all the time. But when something happens, does the manager, does the person who's in conflict actually address it quickly? That's one of the pieces I see not happening in organizations. And then I will say, so how, has this happened before? Yes, it has. How long has it been happening for? Well, actually, it's been going on for about 6 months now. So what has happened? What has the leader done? Oh, well, no, I brought it up to the leader 3 times and they haven't done anything. So again, for whatever reason, someone doesn't address it early. And I find that's one of the biggest things with respectful workplaces, like anything else. When that little nugget starts, it just grows and grows, and it festers over time. And then, for example, one organization I just worked with, it wasn't actually about respectful workplace, but the work that I was doing with them ended up being respectful workplace. And you ended up having 2 camps, believe it or not, 2 groups within the organization, one sort of rallying around one person, another one rallying around another person who were actually in conflict. And it was creating havoc with the organization from a cultural engagement. You had people quitting, no joke. And it all boiled down to one piece over a short period of time for about a month that happened about a year before that. And it just escalated and escalated. So just a couple of quick things, but that's a really good one if you want to start thinking about how that shows up in your world. All right, so in terms of, get ahead, there we go. So what really stops us? So we know all this. We know that if we have all those pieces, what really stops us? And feel free to put stuff in the chat. Again, I think most people, I love that difference. Thanks, Tracy. So most people know that it shouldn't be happening. And even if I was a leader and I didn't notice it and someone brought it to my attention, we often know, right? Or if it's a colleague of mine, or if someone says something about me, what stops us? And often what stops us is that we don't feel, because it's very emotional, right? Whether you're the target, whether you're with someone else, and the attention, as someone said earlier, around what you feel, it's awkward and no one actually wants to deal with it. So oftentimes people know they need to, but they just don't know how, or they're not brave enough to step forward. As a leader, though, if you are one of those folks, that's your responsibility. And as quickly and as fast as you can, if you want to, quote, I said that in a conference a couple of years ago, I said, we just need to nip the stuff in the bud. And it's really stuck with a lot of people. And they say, Heather, we need you to come in so we can nip it in the bud. So with respectful workplace. So think about what's stopping you. Think about what was on that definition that's not showing up in your world, and think about why you're not doing it. All right, so let's get into a little bit more particulars about definitions, because this is, I think, really important. It's really important to acknowledge that things have changed in terms of how we interpret these, what the behaviors that we're seeing, that we see on a frequent basis, and more frequent basis now, actually. So what would be an example of harassment? Oh, fear. Yes, thanks, Ryan. That's excellent. It is. There's a lot of fear involved with a respectful workplace. And I think now that it's in the media too, it's becoming much more commonplace to speak about. There's a lot more people coming forward than they ever did before. And there is a fear factor on both sides. And I think the fear can be misplaced sometimes, but can also be beneficial to help people move forward and deal with things. So love that word. Thanks. So harassment. Can you think of an example of what would be harassment, or a behavior that could show up as harassment? I'm sure somebody's heard of harassment. What could I do that could be perceived as harassment? Intimidation, absolutely. That's a really good one. Intimidation can show up in so many different ways. And depending on the person's style and personality, sometimes people are naturally more intimidating. And people have to be careful to watch the impact, right? Some people are a little bit more soft in their approach. Some people are a little more aggressive. And there's a line. There's absolutely a line. Actually, one thing I am noticing, to go off track a little bit here, is I am noticing when investigations are coming in, or when I've had people who said, I think I'm going to put a complaint in. I actually talked to someone, I don't know, 5 days ago or so, and they were talking about they were going to put a complaint in. And I said, well, okay, perfect. That's great. Let's walk through it. Let's just understand what you're going to get through, what that process looks like, and here's what the results could look like. Okay, so I'm just gonna throw this in here now. It's a little off track, but I think it's important. When you go through a harassment investigation or respectful workplace investigation, and I don't know how your policies are set up, so have a quick look and make sure that this all resonates with you. Although I'll have more in the next session around what you should have in your policies. But you work through a process that is quite formal. Confidentiality is key. Minimal people involved is key. Having said that, the person who's complaining and the person who's responding should both write formal statements. So the complainant, the person who's complaining, should be written in there that they're expected to have a formal statement. Now, the organization or a person in the organization, whether it's an HR, a leader, an external person, can help them write that complaint, because the person who they're complaining about needs to have, and this is, I come in more third party, so it's when things have quite elevated, not just an informal. This is more of a formalized process, okay? Because there is normally an informal process as well, sort of a mediation. Let's just get together and suss it out. But when it gets to the formal side, you've got the complainant will write up their complaint. It will be, and then it will be presented to the respondent, so they get to see, just like in court, you get to see why you're under investigation, and then they get to write their own response. Basically, here's my view of what happened. Everything from, you know, this is exactly physically what happened, this is exactly what I said, I did not say this, I said this instead, all the way to, yes, I think I went over the line, and I accept responsibility, which I've seen as well. So all those extremes play in. Then you have witnesses. So you bring in as minimal witnesses as you can to actually see if it's a breach of policy. And when you're looking at a breach of policy, you have to look at your definition. This is why policies are so important. Make sure they're up to date. Make sure you look at some examples. There's lots of organizations that you'll find within your area, some larger organizations that will have them all posted on the internet. Go in, check yours out, make sure it's somewhat in line. Theirs may be a little bit more robust because they may have more elements and people and processes to walk through. Having said that, make sure it falls in line. So what's the definition of harassment, of sexual harassment, of violence, which plays into this as well? And then did the person actually default on that? So there has to be an investigation, and those investigations theoretically, when you get to a third party, it's a formalized investigation, could actually go to court. So they're very, very precise. They take a great deal of time to write up the reports. So not saying you're going to ever get to that, but just keep that in mind. Document everything. So I say to everyone, if something happens, make sure you document it. And then what happens is the person in breach or not? If the person's in breach, so whether it's an internal or external investigation, if the person's in breach, then they can have everything from a note in their file, so to speak, right? Like, you know, this can't happen, to, you know, we need you to do some anger counseling, to you need to go through respectful workplace training, or we're going to bring it in for the team, all the way up to and including termination. It takes a lot to terminate, though. A lot of people will say, oh, I just want the person gone. And I have to explain to them very early on, well, here's how this works. And even before I start the investigation, I make sure they know that that person being gone, it's not unlikely, it could happen, but it has to be a serious breach to do so. So again, sorry, sidetrack there, but I thought that might be really helpful to give some context over, like, intimidation, as an example, over a period of time, could absolutely lead to termination, but it would have to be quite extreme and probably more pronounced. You know, generally speaking, every investigation is different. So harassment and bullying tie together when we say respectful workplace investigation or harassment investigation, and discrimination plays into that as well. So tell me what you think bullying could look like in the workplace. And we'll talk about the difference now shortly. What would bullying look like? Any ideas there? It's certainly a term we use a lot. Yeah, it could be threatening. It absolutely could be. And again, the terms are often used interchangeably, which we'll talk about in a minute. What about discrimination? Now, we've been talking about it for many, many years. What could be discriminating or threatening? Sorry, I got another one. Criticizing someone's methods, yes, for no reason. Yes, absolutely, that's bullying. So discrimination, what would that look like? what basis could you discriminate someone on? Yes, race and gender, absolutely. So I'll just start with that one. That one's a little bit easier. I think a lot of us can really understand that. So under the Human Rights Act, oh, I'm getting a bit of feedback there, so just make sure everyone's on mute if you can. So it's essentially, oh, still getting feedback there. If everyone can just try to put themselves on mute, that'd be great. So looking at groups, oh, I'm going to have to take my headset off here now. I don't want to hear myself. Okay. If everyone can try to go anyway on mute. All right, so under different types, there's grounds for discrimination. So race and gender being one, we're not going to go through them all, I'll just list them there now. And this is evolving over time, right? Things are being added, like gender identity or expression has been added. So those elements are kind of things we're familiar with. Anyone who's, you know, done any level of schooling generally has seen or heard about this. It's something a little more commonplace. Harassment, though, it is a form. So if you look at the top bullet, I should have done my animations a bit better, apologies. Harassment's a form of discrimination, but it involves something a little different. So it's not under those specific grounds under the law. It's around physical or verbal behavior that offends or humiliates. It generally happens over time, but it can absolutely be one incident, okay? So, for example, someone who threw a desk, right, years ago, who threw a desk, sort of pushed it up and kind of pushed it into the wall and sort of jammed someone behind it. Like, I know it's extreme, but that's a one-time incident that's quite severe, that absolutely would be under harassment. So again, oftentimes though, it's the more subtle things that happen slowly over time that I see more often. Sometimes there might be one incident, but it's often characterized by other things that have led up to that. It can be abusive, offensive, demeaning, or ought. This is the interesting piece here in the second last bullet. Ought to be reasonably known as unwelcome. So certain things, for example, if I do something that I've been doing for 20 years and I go to a new company and I do something and it's seen as unwelcome there, is it the general population would see it as unwelcome? If I yelled at somebody, yes, absolutely it would. If I can't imagine what it would be. I've only seen it once where it hasn't been reasonably known. But again, would most people in the public understand what that looks like? And I'll show you a test now in a minute and how you can think about that. It can be intentional, and as I said before, most times it's actually unintentional. So we tend to judge others by their behavior and we ourselves by our intention. So this is where it gets very confusing and very emotional for people, because if you're offended by my behavior, that's what we need to worry about. The fact that I didn't intend to do it is irrelevant. The fact that I didn't intend it plays into an investigation if it gets to that, because it shows that you didn't mean to do it, so there wasn't intention or malice in your behavior. But at the end of the day, if you do something that offends people over time and you don't change your behavior, then there's a problem. Okay? So this is where I think and I say every single one of us could be in this situation, because it's very much around how other people see things. Okay? Which some people say, well, that's not fair. And I say, well, yes, it is. It's our responsibility to notice. It's our responsibility to get, obviously, to listen if feedback comes through, and for other people to come and give us feedback, hopefully. So harassment can be preventing a person from expressing themselves, yelling, threatening. These are kind of some obvious ones. Constantly interrupting is interesting. And basically preventing someone from speaking. Don't know if you've ever seen that, but I've seen that as well. Sexual advances, which of course we're all very aware of these days, especially. In terms of rude, degrading remarks and jokes, I think when harassment came up years ago and it really started becoming part of our society, that we weren't going to put up with things, this was one of the first things I think most organizations looked at was, the jokes that would fly around the office or things like that. So I think most of you can relate to that. Gestures. It can absolutely, I was involved with one or two in the last 3 years or so, that was gestures. It was movement in a way, whether hands, there's lots of different parts of our bodies, right? So gestures that can be intimidating, that can be sexual, and another one that plays into this too is retaliation. Now, retaliation is something whereby, say, informally, I give you feedback and say something's inappropriate, and it's really making me feel uncomfortable and whatever. And all of a sudden, then you start ganging up on me, and you talk to 4 or 5 other people who basically don't talk to me now, right? I'm not getting a warm welcome. I'm getting cold shoulders. That's retaliation. Retaliation is actually seen in harassment as extreme. So, and it's happened before. I've seen it whereby someone has gone through an investigation, and the person, and should be in your policy, make sure it's in your policy about how you feel about it, and what are the consequences of retaliation, because it absolutely could be up to and including termination. And I always say to employers, you better make sure that people know when they're going through an investigation as a formal process that retaliation will not be accepted. We will come down firm and hard on retaliation, because otherwise no one will ever speak up. Another one that plays out a lot, I find, is gossip, rumors, ridicule, and humiliating is a little more, but sometimes it's the behind closed doors, behind someone's back. I think you lied on that before. Things like that are created and spread and affect someone's character can absolutely be seen as harassment as well. And this is another one that plays in. I know there's a lot here, but compelling a person to perform tasks that are demeaning. So if you're holding someone back, not giving them what they need to do in their job, you're setting them up for failure, perhaps by not giving them opportunities. Name calling, an easier one for people to understand. Ignoring them. And it's funny how often people do this. Now, sometimes people just maybe there's a conflict and they just need to take a step back, and they probably just, don't go near that person that day. But usually with ignoring, it happens over time, and oftentimes it becomes more than one person. Ignoring their presence, not responding to things in meetings, maybe they're not giving them their time to speak, or they're, again, I said before, cutting them off, or maybe they're not responding to questions, right? Offering them work is another one as well that really plays into it. So reasonable person test, how does this play out? So would most people do the action unacceptable? Now, again, that's generally how they look at the reasonable person test. The challenge with that is that people sort of consider, well, what is unacceptable? Right? Would most people consider that unacceptable? Some people, there's a little bit tougher way to think about it. So one that I like is the Graham test. It could be the Graham test. It could be the grandparent test. So would I say or do this, I'll poke that in there, or do this in the presence of my grandparent, my spouse, or my child? So if I'm going to make a comment or I'm going to do something, is it something that would be done with them present? And there's the Okay, I think I'm back. Let me know if you can hear me. Okay, perfect. I'm getting feedback here too. I'm going to take this off speaker. Hopefully you can still hear me, so I don't have to hear myself speaking back at me. So just remember you're on mute if you can. Sorry about that. I did have some technical difficulties this morning, so apologies. So at least, what we'll do, I'm not quite sure when I cut off, but we'll start in bullying. And I think the most challenging thing with bullying, I think people have, is they don't understand what the variation or the difference is. A lot of organizations can actually use bullying interchangeably with harassment, okay, or it's an element of harassment. Some people will have definitions, other people will refer to it as part of the policy, but they don't define it. So you really have to make a decision. You find another policy you like and go with it. I think the terminology is actually kind of nice to put in there. Generally, though, in your policies, you want to make sure that you have examples. Okay, they're not all-inclusive examples, but examples of what bullying could look like. And so I'll give you some things that I see. You don't have to use these or anything, but I'll just give you some things in a minute that I see. Usually bullying isn't seen the same as a physical gesture. Usually bullying, some people could say, yes, it could shove someone, etc. Oftentimes people see that as violence in the workplace. So bullying is often psychological acts. So mentally hurt somebody. Someone said earlier about intimidation could come out in this as well. They're often isolating people in the workplace. Okay? They're often repeated things over time that hit a boiling point. And it's something that people do that will obviously offend someone. And we see it in kids' schools. I mean, they have and my daughter's actually seen a little bit of it recently, which is sad to say, and just by glaring, believe it or not, by some of the girls that I've seen think are a little bit being a little mean. So helping her deal with that from her end and trying to get her the confidence to actually speak up to them. Not easy to do with an 11-year-old. But anyway, the intimidation piece plays in. Does it make the person feel off? I think sometimes with bullying, people who do it, there is a level of control they want to have. Often there's some insecurities there, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's the impact, right? Some of the areas that I sort of see a little bit more common, I'll just put them all up here. Rolling of the eyes. Do people roll their eyes? Do they have dripping sarcasm or just a tone that's off when they talk to someone in particular? Oh, do you really think so, Sally? You're sure now? Like sarcasm over time. This is something I see more over time. That really sort of makes someone feel bad at first, and then it just snowballs over a period of time. Withholding information is another one, right? Not keeping them in the loop can be bullying. Again, it's harder to prove, but usually what I see is a combination of things playing together. And people generally know. So if I call witnesses, or if I say, speak to someone, about a certain specific incident or event, there's always a general question. Have you seen this sort of behavior before? What sort of behavior would you notice with this person, in terms of bullying and harassment? And usually there's other things that are at play. And we talked about a couple of these. Actually, changing work guidelines, right? You can't just go around and change guidelines, especially if it's not fair for everyone involved. Okay? Sometimes actually bullying has come up with one leader who bullies their entire team. It could be one person on a team that bullies people in another department. So you just have to really start thinking about what the definition is and how you describe it. The training that you give the team or the teams within your organization, can you have conversations around what these mean, right? What is acceptable, what isn't acceptable? So, and again, blocking training is another one. I saw that not too long ago, where there were other things as well, but the person was the only person on the team who didn't get a certain type of training. So again, what does it look like? You get to decide whether you use the word interchangeably or you embed it into, if you do embed it into it as a separate entity, you have to make sure there's a definition around it and ideally examples of what it could look like. So what isn't harassment? Can you tell me something that you know isn't harassment? And we'll finish up on this slide. What could I do that isn't harassment? It may not be the most positive. What can you think of? I'll give you a hint. No one can think of anything. When's the time when someone could say something that you don't like to hear, but it's acceptable? What could that be? Yeah, perfect. Ask someone to fix a mistake. Absolutely. It could be performance related. It could be something that we don't like to hear, as long as we don't do it in a bullying way or a tone or a mannerism or in an aggressive way that may fall under harassment. Absolutely. It's something that can be extremely acceptable in the workplace. And I think this is where, interestingly, I'll make a quick comment on this once I get through it around what I'm noticing. So a difference of opinion. Right? It could be around, two employees disagree on a process or how you're going to move forward on something. As long as it doesn't elevate, as long as people aren't throwing names or belittling or gossiping or getting people to rally behind them against somebody, it is absolutely not harassment. Manager following up on absences, or deadlines, right? If they made a mistake, there's a deadline that didn't get met, there's an absence there as well. Because what we don't want to do is have leaders not be able to lead. Right? So legitimate feedback, progressive discipline, right? Well, this has happened over a period of time. When you made a mistake yesterday, it just was another mistake that we're adding to that. We need you to fix this. By the following, we're going to support you. We'll give you the training you need, but we need you to have a change and have no mistakes by a period of time, or whatever it might look like. Hug between friends. Okay, so between friends is the piece there. Enforcing policies or rules, as long as they're done equally by all staff. So in other words, saying, well, okay, anyone who's hired, one person in the team hasn't, got hired in the last 3 months. Well, everyone else gets to go for training, but you don't, right? So you can't have that. You can't have things that will discriminate against people or be obvious that someone's being excluded. Now, unless it's performance related, right? If you have to qualify, you have to have at least a level 3 or midpoint on your performance to be able to qualify for training. Absolutely, that's appropriate. Or one isolated remark generally. So unless it's extreme, right? Sometimes I say people, oh my gosh, sometimes if there's, you've heard me say the trust bucket, right? So if someone says something a little off and you have a good relationship with them, you're probably likely to go, interesting, didn't like that. But often it's not huge, it's not monumental, and someone can just move on from it. Okay, so it depends on the impact. So if employees started to niggle everything that was said, it wouldn't make sense, and the reasonable person wouldn't comment on it. So one thing I will say for this one, we'll finish up here, is what I am noticing is that we've talked about leadership styles in the past. We've talked about a different approach. I'll give you a quick scenario. Person comes, I go into this organization, there's a problem, there's a harassment investigation, but they wanted me to do more of a mediation, which I call more team coaching, so trying to figure out what the problem was. And what the person had said to me when I first met with them, of course I hadn't gotten the context, or there was no written formal, I hadn't gotten quite to a formalized investigation, kind of going in advance. The person said, well, we changed leaders, and this person is this way and that way. And, a little bit less communicative, right? Not as much communications coming down the pipeline. I don't get to do this and this and this. And so when I asked, well, those 3 things, how do they fit? Like, how do they fit in your job description? Well, actually, no, that's just what the other manager let him do. He delegated a couple of things to me. And so, in the last 3 months before he was here, I got to do this or I got to do that. But it wasn't necessarily something the new leader agreed with. So all of a sudden, the style is changing, the communication style is changing, and it went from not from just giving feedback or asking to do those things. It went straight to an investigation piece because she was feeling extremely offended by it and really upset. But it wasn't necessarily harassment. Now, I'm not saying there wasn't things that could have been done better. There absolutely should have been feedback. There should have been more communication because they're just getting together, how's it going, all those pieces. But it ended up being, at the end of the day, when we worked it out, and we did, they worked it out and they came up with ground rules on how to work together. It was actually around style. And so there was a little give and take on both sides. There was agreements made on if something comes up again, how they're going to deal with it. But I'm noticing more of that now. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just people need to understand what harassment really is. Because if you go under an investigation or you put a complaint in, it has to follow under that policy. If it doesn't follow under your policy, then it's not going to be considered harassment. And the person will go through all that, and potentially there will be no breach. And it's exhausting, and it's very emotional for people. So anyway, I know there's a lot of definitions today. Hopefully it gave you something to think about. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit more about what you can do personally in terms of situations. We'll come up with a few scenarios, and we're going to talk about what organizations need within the workplace. And by all means, putting notes in the chat, even in private. If there's any questions around your policies, I can't read all your policies or anything, but if there's anything around your policies or your procedures, I'm happy to reference those as well. So we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Hopefully it was helpful. And if hopefully it's as beautiful out today up in Nova Scotia as it is down here in Newfoundland, which I'm happy to say is beautiful here today. So have a good one, and we'll talk to you in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone.